here. I want to introduce you to Eliana Adler, our speaker today. Eliana Adler is Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the Pennsylvania State University. She's a historian of the modern Jewish experience in Eastern Europe, with particular interest in the history of education, religion, gender studies, Holocaust historiography, and memory. Her first book was In Her Hands, The Education of Jewish Girls in Tsarist Russia, which traced the emergence and development of formal schooling for Jewish girls in pre-revolutionary Russia. She's also co-edited volumes on the history of Jewish education in Eastern Europe, the memory of Eastern Europe and the American Jewish community and family and the Holocaust. Currently, she's working on a project, which we'll hear about today, on the experience of Polish Jews who survived World War II in the unoccupied regions of the USSR, and starting a new one on what the topic for today is, memorial books. She's got a zillion publications, which I'm not going to go take the time to go through, but we're really looking forward to your talk. Thank you so much for coming. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eliana.
Thank you. All right. So, many years ago, I was I had finished college, and I was applying to graduate school, and I had a job at in cataloging in Judaic cataloging in a university library. And my job, was very entry level, was just to put in the absolutely obvious information. What language is the book in? What's the author's name? Those kind of things that anybody could do. And then my supervisor would go through and find the Library of Congress number and get the subject and figure out the more complicated stuff. So one day, I was sitting at my desk there, and a book came across my desk that was impossible to categorize. I could not figure out the language because it was in 3 different languages. It wasn't clear which end I should even open the book on. It was in Hebrew and Yiddish, and there was a little piece in English. There was a list of many authors and editors. The subject, the topic, the theme, nothing about it was clear. So on the one hand, it was, I couldn't do my job, but on the other hand, I was completely fascinated, and I spent pretty much the whole rest of the day looking at that book, which was bigger than the town it purported to be about. It was about a small town in Poland, and it was this gigantic book about it, the Jewish community there. So this was my first interaction with a Polish Jewish memorial book. In Yiddish, they're called a Yizkerbuch, or the plural is Yizkerbücher. And I was utterly entranced. At the time, it didn't even occur to me, I was applying to graduate school right at that moment, but that I could write about these books. I just thought, those are interesting. And I have used them over the years. I've used them in my research, on both of my other projects that Max mentioned, and I've used them in my teaching in a variety of different ways. But only within the past few years did it come to my attention that I realized that I could actually write about these books. And so that's what I'm doing. And I'll be telling you about today's my exploration of this topic. And it's very much in progress. So I want to tell you just broad contours about the book that I'm imagining, which undoubtedly will not look like this by the time I finally write it, but gives you a sense of some of the themes that interest me in these books. And then I'm going to narrow in on one topic to really speak about so you get more of a sense of what one can do with these books. So in its current iteration, my imagined book begins with an introduction to the Yizkerbuch, and then the first chapter looks at precedents. How do we explain the emergence of this genre? What did it come from within Jewish communal examples? There are ancient ones, there are more modern ones that one can point to, and also non-Jewish. What other memorial books might have been influencing these communities to create these out of the Holocaust? The second chapter looks at, once the books begin to be created, how they go from the very first ones that come out in DP camps are basically lists of names of the dead. You know, very practical, very necessary, but not that much in the way of content. But within a few years, they become these gigantic anthologies of everything. So trying to figure out how and where that happened, that change came about. And then I'm interested in the ways in which they function to bring together the communities that had been destroyed. Because the claim of the books is that there's nothing left, you can't go back, there's no one, it's all gone. And yet in the act of creating these books, they themselves are reconstituting those communities, although in a very different way, of course. Then specifically looking at the Holocaust, how they write about the Holocaust, but also what is the community that they want to reconstruct? What do they think is the most important thing to point to about that past that they're describing? And then what I'm calling the afterlife, which is how these books have been used subsequently, because they were very important for that first generation that created them. But then they kind of disappeared. Nobody, I mean, people have them on a bottom shelf. They use them for a doorstop. People didn't know quite what to do with them. They're very old-fashioned in their style. They're very amateurish. They're written in languages that people don't really read. The Hebrew is, you know, people who went to a Hebrew school in Poland in the interwar period were then writing this after the war in this very stilted, old-fashioned Hebrew. So even people who read the languages have difficulty with them, let alone the Yiddish, which not that many people read any longer. But they are having a certain sort of renaissance, but in surprising ways, surprising directions, and that's what I'll look at. And then in the conclusion, finally, thinking a little more broadly, what do they say about migration, about genocide, about memory? What can we learn from these books? So that's the broad overview. I'm happy to talk more about any part of that. But yes, but now I want to move to the actual topic of today's paper, because I can't just generally, of course. Okay. So here we go. Yes. All right. I am one of the fortunate. I've come back to the place of suffering. I thought that everything would bear witness to terror and appalling injustice. Unfortunately, this isn't so. I must call upon memory to recreate the horrifying scenes, and in the quiet on this green carpet of grass, to restore that which occurred here. So describes Yankiv Evanson, his conflicted return home at the end of the war. He's pained by the realization that his hometown of Nowy Dwór Mazowiecki does not bear visual witness to the destruction of the Jewish community, and he feels called upon to fill in this lost knowledge. He proceeds to discuss the local Holocaust experience and his return after his own liberation from a camp in Czech territory. His essay, In Pinkis Nowy Dwór, published in Tel Aviv in 1965, ends with all the surviving Jews who have sort of gathered there after the war leaving. Yet it stays with him. His dreams and reality, he writes, remained poisoned by the nearness and freshness of that nightmare. So this paper seeks to interrogate narratives of homecoming, like this one in post-war Yizkor-Bücher, memorializing Polish Jewish communities. Almost every Yizkor book that I have examined includes at least one narrative of homecoming right after the war. Some of them also have later, like in the 70s, somebody came back. Most of them have this early war return essay. So what does it mean to come home to a town that is no longer home? How do the authors capture their emotions in words? Which images do they use to illustrate their sense of loss? How do they write about the people who remain? In reading through tens of Yizkor-Bücher, I've noticed a number of recurring themes in these homecoming essays, and these include an effort to describe a feeling of emptiness within a still living place, what I've called embodied surveys, which is going sort of door by door through these places, and the search for detailed local Holocaust information. To begin with ambivalent emptiness. In his essay in his Yiskerbuch, Yisroel Gershon Hankovitz narrates returning to Putsk in the summer of 1946. The city is almost entirely unchanged, he writes. The houses not destroyed, the trees not uprooted. The children run hither and thither in the streets. At the same time, this is a different city, as if it lost its soul. Herein lies the central paradox of this particular genre of homecoming story. In each of the Yiskerbücher, the author is returning to a town that is still functional, still living, filled with people going about their lives. Yet he or she does not see that which is missing. As Hankovitz continues, how is it possible to eulogize a city that is fully intact, but something within it is forever dead? The authors of these testimonies of return grapple with expressing this duality, employing different images and strategies. One approach is to acknowledge the anomaly directly, like Hankovitz or Evanson in the introduction. For other authors, the presence of absence overwhelms the present circumstances. Describing her visit to Shijevo after the war, Hannah Gramadsky-Gottlieb experiences pervasive death and loss. I think that every stone is dripping with blood. People live in all the houses now as if nothing had happened. Only I still hear the screams that come from each building. Similarly, as evening arrives in his former hometown of Sherbs, Abraham Tatz writes of silence and emptiness wherever he looks. By the final line, he too has disappeared. Dear nearby shadows descend from every corner, from every alleyway. They peer at me, mute and strange. I close my eyes and also become a shadow, just like them. In addition to expressing their personal reactions to the experience of returning to their hometowns, many of the authors of these texts sought to describe the physical changes that had taken place in their absence. And they did this via a town survey. And this is not metaphorical. The author actually takes the reader on a house-by-house or street-by-street journey, naming each home and business that had been replaced and repurposed and mapping the transformation. In this way, a palimpsest is surfaced. The reader, like the returnee, can glimpse the specters of the Jewish homeowners and shopkeepers who lived and worked there not so long before. These embodied surveys typically begin in the town square and end in the cemetery. Yosef Reich opens his article, Belchatov Without Jews, with the statement, I feel oddly alien in the town where I was born and raised, echoing the ambivalent emptiness reflected above. He goes on to emphasize the contrast between the present and the past in his walk through his native town, with descriptions such as, here I stand in the marketplace and consider the house which is located right at the corner of Papianin Street. Here, a few steps up, was Herschel Plavner's store. I walk closer and am greeted with a bitter sight. Now they sell holy pictures and crucifixes there. This alienation that Reich describes experiencing in the still vibrant Rinnig or marketplace is replaced by outrage by the time he reaches the Jewish cemetery, emptied of tombstones. When he discovers the tombstones, neatly inserted into the new bridge over the stream, the rupture is too much to bear. Reich abandons his orderly description of the town, and he addresses its residents directly. You live in our homes. You sleep in our beds and use our bedding. You wear our clothes. At least do not obliterate our holy places. Powerful images of the misuse of Jewish objects and spaces appear in many of the accounts of return. As with Reich's depiction of Catholic religious items being sold out of a formerly Jewish store, these juxtapositions function as a form of commentary on the changes in the town. For Zevel Zaltstein, arriving back in his native Radzin in 1946, the moment of reckoning was watching a non-Jewish shopkeeper wrapping packages in pages of the Talmud. Esther Yakubovich, on her walk through Bolochiv in 1945, describes seeing scraps of the Torah scrolls amidst the public garbage piles. As with Reich above, however, it is generally the desecration of Jewish cemeteries that leaves the most powerful impression. Graveyards represent a connection to pre-war life, the burial places of parents and grandparents, who died of natural causes in earlier times, and often also to mass graves of victims of the Holocaust. Sites of burial are sacred in many cultures, Jewish among them, and the German destruction of Jewish cemeteries was deliberate and systematic. Witnessing how their former neighbors either passively benefited from the roads and bridges constructed out of Jewish tombstones or actively engaged in ongoing acts of violation further alienated the Jewish returnees. As Yechiel Weitzman writes, from the Jewish perspective, the role of the cemetery as a place of murder and mass graves turned it into a Holocaust memorial and a site of martyrdom, and further emphasized the religious and moral problems of cemetery desecration and the importance of their preservation. Some of the authors use their shock and pain at this betrayal as the literary device to signal the end of their journey through the town. Ruchel Zaltstein-Fletter returned to Radzin after decommissioning from the Red Army. Yet soon after meeting up with some other Jewish survivors, one of their number was murdered, and they had to go to the cemetery to bury her. We almost did not recognize the cemetery. Half the place was plowed up and had corn growing. Cows are grazing on the other half, and there is no sign of a tombstone. In answer to our question as to why he is pasturing her cows there, the shepherd answers, "There's good grass here." She goes on to write, "With great sadness, we leave the Jewish cemetery for the last time. What once was does not exist anymore. Our return has made it clear to us that we have nothing more to do here. The air is stifling. For years I dreamt about the shtetl, but now everything is strange to us, and we must escape from here." For other survivors who describe their post-war returns, the encounter with desecrated burial sites led to a different sort of embodied quest. They became physically engaged with cemetery restoration, with the erection of monuments, and also with exhumation and reburial of the remains of Jews shot in surrounding locations. In a grotesque reversal of the typical survey of the heart of the town, an article in the Yizkerbuch for Bilgurai follows the author as he combs the surrounding countryside for evidence of hasty burials. Each site and the bodies found there are carefully and laconically documented. And I quote, "In the Boyer forest, we took out Mrs. Zilberfein." Across the various essays of return, naming is a constant and especially associated with names of places. Whether in the forest or the marketplace, the authors seek to provide as much information as they can about the previous inhabitants and their precise locations. In his essay on the ruins for Pinchas Sokachev, L. Furstenberg begins with an ambivalent sense of return. He writes, "In April 1946, after a 7-year absence, I returned to Sokachev, and I did not recognize the town. I could simply not believe that I was in the town I had lived in for so many years." Furstenberg then begins to move through the town, providing a dense array of names and places. And I won't read all of them, but just the level of detail that you see here gives you a sense. Furstenberg ends his survey at the fresh grave of the youth Weinberg, murdered after his own return to Sokachev. "I left the cemetery physically broken," he writes, "agonized and with great feelings of revenge." Ben Giladi's The Past Revisited in the Yizkerbuch for Piotrków-Tribunalski is particularly complex as it encompasses 3 levels of knowledge simultaneously. He interacts with the town in its post-war present while imagining both the pre-war Jewish past and the wartime tortures. So if we just look at the bottom paragraph there, first he's describing what used to be there, and then in that same spot, he's reminded of what was happening there during the war. So all of that together. The surveys each include rich local detail, including names of people and places. These demonstrate their distinctiveness, even as the trajectory through the towns is often similar. The act of walking through the shtetl, even if only in memory, proved meaningful for many returnees. Claire Rishbeth and Mark Powell have suggested that moving through an urban landscape can help to unearth memories. In studying what they call the emotional geographies of place, they encourage migrants to tell their stories while in motion. These Holocaust survivors and refugees may have independently discovered the same phenomenon. Whereas Giladi experienced the horrors of his hometown firsthand before his deportation, many of the stories of return come from those who spent the Holocaust years elsewhere, especially as refugees in the unoccupied regions of the USSR. This gives them a particular perspective, as their shock at the transformation is greater than those who witnessed some of it, and also particular needs. They're looking for surviving family members and for information about those who perished. They seek help from Jews and non-Jews in this quest. Their stories of homecoming tell us both about their priorities and about what they found. Not surprisingly, the returnees first look for Jews. In his essay for the Yizkor book for Alexander Vodsky, Avraham Tenenbaum writes, "I looked for familiar faces." It becomes clear that this means Jews when he excitedly approaches a young man walking with a cane. Even before he can see the man's face, this anomalous physical condition marks him out as a Holocaust survivor. However, the man signals for Tenenbaum not to approach him, and then explains that he has contagious disease. In Tenenbaum's retelling, there are no other interactions. He cannot find the people he is seeking, and he makes the decision to join his own people in the land of Israel. Leah Zaks uses similar language in her contribution to the Daubrova Memorial Volume, and then expands upon it. After the Holocaust, she writes, I sought familiar faces. I looked for poor people, wealthy, youngsters, old folk. I looked for our people. While this search was often fruitless, sometimes local Jews were eventually found and could pass on information. After wandering for some time, L. Friedman located the remaining or returned Jews in Medjugorje after his 1946 repatriation. From them, he learned about the Holocaust in his hometown. And just the bottom part, I'll just read. I sat and listened to them as they told the same details 3 or 4 times over. I did not interrupt them. I wanted to know everything. I sat shiva for my relatives, for my city and home. This excerpt demonstrates once again the importance of names. For Friedman, as well as for other survivors and repatriates, providing the names of individual victims and survivors was crucial. When no Jews remained, or the other survivors did not know about the fates of their loved ones, returning Jews turned to non-Jewish residents of their hometowns, chiefly neighbors and janitors. Non-Jewish witnesses in the towns are depicted in a variety of ways. Some are hostile, some gentle, some in between the two extremes. Ephraim Weichselfish, after walking through the desolation in Kutna, found the janitor of his family's building. I wanted to hear from her some details about Jewish families or individuals that were saved from the slaughter. At my question, why did she not hide the daughter of Abraham Roz and the daughters of the Cooper family, those whose father was Ari, she replied that after all the Jews were reported to the ghetto, Yosef Javitsky hid Itam Roz during the war, but toward the end he handed himself over to the Gestapo. After the liberation, the Polish police had sentenced him to death. So while she did not directly answer his question, the janitor's response retroactively justified her own refusal to hide Jews in demonstrating that those who did were later punished by the authorities. The following response portrays a different sort of punishment. In his essay of Return to Szczytno after the war, Y. Davidovich found only non-Jewish Poles residing in his home shtetl. Although he spoke to many of them, he found it difficult to get straight answers about what happened and who was to blame. One of the most interesting interactions was with a couple in a house that had previously belonged to Jews. When he asked if any Jews had survived in the village, the woman explained that the handful of survivors had been murdered by ours. that is Poles. There were bandits. The wife, a stout one, but with a worn face, said, many misfortunes had come to the shtetl because of them. There is an epidemic every year of another misfortune. Kazimierczak mutilated his hand with an unusual nail, and it had to be amputated. Is that not punishment from God? He had stolen a little in the ghetto. Kazimierczak's bull went insane and trampled his daughter. Who knows how many more misfortunes await us? The horseshoes, which we've placed over our thresholds, do not help. There are angry spirits in the shtetl that want to take revenge. Sitting in a formerly Jewish home, on furniture inherited from deported and murdered Jews, she could blame the killing on others. Yet she clearly felt that the supernatural retribution was more general and could strike the whole town. From local people, Jewish and non-Jewish Poles, the returnees pieced together the facets of the wartime tragedies. On a purely factual basis, historians can learn about the Holocaust on a local level, even forensic level, in some of these testimonies. Yet there is at least as much to be gathered about memory. In these stories of homecoming, Jewish survivors pass along information about how Jews lived and died during the war. The non-Jewish witnesses have more to say about the behavior of bystanders. Germans are mentioned only infrequently and vaguely. So now to some conclusions. This work has described three common aspects of narratives of homecoming in post-war Polish Jewish memorial books. The majority of these books contain testimonies of return, and they tend to include sentiments of ambivalent emptiness, examples of embodied surveys, and a search for information about the Holocaust on a local level. These testimonies, all written by people far from their towns of origin, represent the efforts of migrants and victims of genocide to gather and preserve knowledge of communities that no longer existed. The memorial volumes that they produced were internal documents, written mainly in Yiddish and Hebrew, and laid claim to layers of historical and cultural knowledge about their former hometowns. Yet, they did not seek to actively intervene in the contemporary physical spaces beyond perhaps establishing memorials on mass graves. The editorial committees of the Yizkor assiduously collected and disseminated what would otherwise have been lost knowledge about Jewish communities across Poland. But this knowledge remained within the surviving remnants of those same communities, and perhaps their offspring. The books allowed them to hold onto the emotional aspects of their post-war journeys home, as well as the knowledge that they gained there. Previous scholars have also noted the prevalence of essays of return in the Yizkor. Jack Pugamas and Jonathan Boyarin included a section called Going Home Again in the introduction to their important book, From a Ruined Garden. They conclude that in returning to their hometowns, I'm quoting here, survivors generally came to realize how total the rupture with the past had been. And even the most positive encounter with the local Polish non-Jewish population reinforced that sense of rupture. End quote. They also focus on survivors' post-war efforts to build monuments at mass graves. In her more literary approach, Monika Adamczyk-Garbowska suggests that these stories might paint a more nuanced picture of post-war Poland, as opposed to more partisan testimonies from a later period. She's certainly correct that the narratives in the Yizkor tend to eschew politics. However, she also finds that just as the pre-war towns are idealized, so too the post-war towns become symbols of death and loss, rather than three-dimensional urban organisms. There is a way in which the impossibility of homecoming forms a trope in modern culture. As David Lowenthal writes, for mobile modern man, nostalgia is not so much being uprooted as having to live in an alien present. Yet, as Adamczyk-Garbowska hints, Jewish history and culture nuance this refrain in particular ways. Sergio Jacob Ezrahi has written of the twin poles of exile and homecoming in Jewish thought and literature. Jews constructed not only memory temples and Sabbaths out of the ruins of their material existence, but also stories out of the relics and hearths that were abandoned along the way and were, by definition, remote from the sacred center. Of course, she's writing about the desire for return to Zion, but in the modern era, there was also nostalgia for Jewish life in Eastern Europe, even threatening to overwhelm the age-old orientation at times. And she goes on to write about, to refer us to Pierre Nora. Should we read what Pierre Nora might call les lieux du mémoire juif, not as new memory palaces, but as reliquaries, constructed out of the Holy Land by a modern imagination, increasingly intoxicated by the sanctification of place. Founded belatedly on nostalgia and on incomplete mourning, the diasporic imagination will eventually generate a post-war Europe without walls as a site of pilgrimage, literary at first, and then literal, a substitute for Jerusalem as the ruined shrine. As Rafi here is referring both to Hebrew and Yiddish literature of the shtetl and to its somewhat ironic stance toward the old country, as well as the shattering experience of the Holocaust. Migration, with its attendant complex relationship with multiple homelands, has long been a feature of Eastern European Jewish life. In his article, The Home That Never Was, Rethinking Space and Memory in Late 19th and 20th Century Jewish History, Frank Wolf employs the term mythscape to depict the myth-making involved in how Jewish survivors and refugees wrote about their former homes. Yet the Holocaust period created a caesura in this relationship. For Sławomir Kapralski, writing about the post-war period, Memoryscapes better captures the realm of the imaginary, while also pointing to the centrality of memory in the project of reconstructing the after-image of destroyed communal spaces. The Yizkor engaged actively in this project. Generally, as much as half of any given memorial volume is devoted to the pre-war period, filled with recipes, hagiographies of rabbis, photographs, essays about youth groups and schools, reminiscences of an idyllic life before the war. The period of the war and the Holocaust is often presented as a break, the end of childhood, the end of positive interactions with other communities. This appears in a separate section of the book. These two sections, along with the necrology, form the bulk of the memorial volumes. Post-war narratives are a bit of an afterthought, often placed outside of strict divisions and toward the end of the books. They don't quite fit in with the main categories of the material, and yet, arguably, they tie them all together and present researchers with interesting opportunities for further research. It proves impossible to write about post-war return without referencing both the pre-lapsarian past and the terrors of the Holocaust. The words and images that returnees use to discuss their ambivalent reactions are telling. Moreover, when words fail them, they use their bodies to move through the space and mark what has changed. We've also seen that gathering information about the local Holocaust is not only fraught, but bifurcated. Only by speaking to both Jews and non-Jews can one piece together any sense of the situation during the war. In this way, the essays combine multiple levels of knowledge and memories of the towns. Additionally, they demonstrate the riches and layers contained in these nostalgic tomes. So I stated at the start that this is one piece of a larger project, just sort of an example. I hope it gives you a sense of what we can learn from Yizkor, in addition to what I consider their inherent value and their fascination. I'd like to highlight just at the end some of the other entryways into a number of different vibrant subfields within Holocaust studies and genocide studies that they offer us. It has already been well documented, and it remains somewhat of a source of contention, that the very concept of genocide, of course, grew out of the experience of the Holocaust, and subsequently, in part due to the volume of scholarship actively relating to the Holocaust, many of the concepts, sort of key concepts that come out of Holocaust studies have then been transferred and applied to other genocides more broadly. This also happens the other direction more recently. So I want to close by just gesturing to some of the big ideas raised by this work and how it might be relevant to comparative research. I'm not going to talk about all of them, given what time it is, but we can just point at them and maybe talk about them more later, should we wish to. So Whereas there has come to be, in the study of the Holocaust more generally, as well as in popular culture, a very sort of sense of who is a survivor and what is a survivor and this sort of secular saint. Within these books, anyone can write. People who left 50 years ago have as much right to write about those towns as people who left only after the war. So the idea of survival and surviving what, I think is challenged by these books because they're all migrants. They all left because of difficult circumstances there. The books also point us toward the sort of subfield of aftermath studies. That is what happens after genocide, because genocide never really ends. We all sort of know that at a very basic level. There isn't a day on which it ends. And so what do people do with their experience? How do they take it forward? Testimony is a very active field within the study of the Holocaust and genocide more broadly, but I would say these particular testimonies are a corner that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. They're written, short testimonies by people who mostly, on the whole, never wrote anything before. And they just, sort of put it sometimes in terribly raw language, sometimes deeply offensive language. They just put it out there. Memorialization is the purpose of these books, but it's also something the books describe. So they say, on the one hand, this is a memorial, but then they also show pictures of other memorials that they're also building at the same time as they're building this one. Local knowledge, just that, which I tried to show here, just the exact what happened in that particular place, you can see in these books in a way that we just can't in most other sources. Local relations are very much a subject here, and the whole idea of neighbors, which comes from the study of the Holocaust and has moved out, is very relevant here. And I would say that they also, not only in the maps that are contained, and I showed a few pictures here, but also just in their approach, they give us a very, in some ways, visual and geographic way of looking at these places and what happened there. And there's a lot in terms of digital humanities and in other ways that can be done with these volumes and the information that they have. And that's the gist of it. There's always more to say.
So we have plenty of time for Q&A. I'll just let, if you don't mind, Eliana, you can wait for Q&A.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much. This was really, it's just such fascinating research. I'm curious because you've depicted here how the actual contents of these books are kind of repainting a picture of the towns before this destruction. But it feels like also, given that they're collectively written by so many different authors in many cases, that also that process of creating the book itself is also a process of community rebuilding or
Yes.
reconstituting that community. And I'm wondering if you've thought about, or if can you talk a little bit about what the process of actually creating the books is? How are people reconnected in the process of writing the books?
Yes, yeah, so that's something I've been trying to get at. And I've been reading correspondence in, they're all sort of sending each other material from all over the place. And so I'm reading their letters and what they write in the newspaper also. So on the one hand, they're calling, so in each individual country, so say in Argentina, in the Yiddish newspaper there, they're calling for anyone who's from that particular town to send in materials. So they're on a local level, they're forming communities. But then also whoever is the head of the book committee in Argentina is writing to the person who's in charge in Paris and saying, here's when our materials are gonna come and what sort of materials are you finding? One of the surprising things that I found in this correspondence is how often they're in touch with Poland. Because one of the things they all say in the introductions is, it's gone, there's nothing, we're never going back, there's no one and nothing. Meanwhile, they're writing to the archivist in their town and being like, Cheshov, can you send us this material? Because that's where they're from, they know those people. And sometimes they're asking local Jews who are still living, not in those smaller towns, but in larger towns, to send them material also. So there's all these complicated correspondence, and some of it I haven't, this mostly, there's a couple people who were able to do oral histories. I can't, it's too late for me. There was a lot of infighting, huge amount, and that's part of community too, right? That's what people do. So there's a couple oral histories of people just tearing each other apart over these books. And there was one book published in Paris that they left out the most famous Jew from that town. Like one of the best Yiddish writers, they left him out because they didn't like his politics. So then someone else had to come along and make another book of that town. So there's a lot going on, which is mostly invisible in the books themselves. Sometimes in the books, there's like an apology. Oh, if we offended anyone, we're sorry. But it's so much more than that. So yeah, the good and the bad. Yes.
I have a related question. The way you described it, it sounds like these books have a kind of almost standard form with the same kinds of components. And I wonder, is that something that evolved over time, or one community modeling their book on what another community had done? Were they sort of diverse and heterogeneous at first, and then slowly, gradually came to be more standardized? How did you experience the evolution of this genre?
I've been trying to figure that out, really. And the answer is no, they're not diverse. There is a standard formula, but I don't know why or where exactly. There's the very first ones that are just names. That's like 46, 47. And then suddenly, in 1950, they start publishing these gigantic books that are mostly about the pre-war period and have all those same sections. And then those just keep continuing. But there's a handful that come out in the 1950s, and it's not just in one place. So, you know, how they sort of innately knew what needed to be in one of these books is not clear, but they all did. And then they all, you know, any ones that came later, of course they were gonna follow that same formula. And I think in some ways that uniformity is one of the reasons that they've been somewhat dismissed by scholars. Mostly scholars are, think of them as pretty amateurish and not that much of value there. And partly is they kind of look the same. They're so different if you bother to read them, but they look like it's just every Polish town is kind of the same. Yeah, please.
Thanks, I noticed in a few publishing places, and you mentioned Paris and Tel Aviv popped up several times within a different decades. I'm wondering how publishing houses were an active participant in the production of these books, or were they sort of passive? Was there another story that publishing houses had involved about?
Yeah, so these are like vanity volumes. They're pretty much, almost all of them are published by Organization for Jews from Sotochev. And they're published by subscription, just to their members. They tried to give a few to museums, if museums were willing to take them. And by the mid-60s, Tel Aviv becomes the place where they're being published. Up until that point, it's much more varied, and they're coming from a lot of different diasporic communities. But Israel kind of takes over and sometimes takes over in a pretty aggressive way. That also comes out in the correspondence, like, oh, the Israel Book Committee said they're going to take over all our materials, but we in Canada were trying to do our own book, but they say they have the know-how to do it. It's not so much the publishing houses as their own internal process.
To build on that question, I mean, is the publishing history, the way these books get published, I mean, is this connected with how Israel's grappling with the Holocaust after the Eichmann trial and stuff like this? And I guess related to that is, are these all being originally written? You mentioned they're written in different languages. Are they mostly being written in Yiddish? And then when they're published in Tel Aviv, are they translated into Hebrew, or are they being published in Yiddish?
There's a lot of interesting language politics going on. In the first part of your question, before the language, you asked something else.
Eichmann trial.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a way in which, yes, we can see these partly as sort of part of memorialization in Israel, and we can also see them as counter memory, because they're not sort of the same Zionist narrative of it was all bad in the old country, and then we came here to, build a real life. there's a lot of beauty in them. So I think they go both ways there. And in terms of language, mostly the ones published in Israel are mostly half and half. And sometimes you can tell because they'll say who wrote each piece, and sometimes you can't, but I still think it's the case that basically everyone who sent in from elsewhere sent it in Yiddish, and they left it in Yiddish. And the people in Israel were encouraged to write in Hebrew, even if they couldn't write in very good Hebrew. And so they're not translations. The two halves present different material. And then sometimes the American Jews from that town were paying for a lot of this. They had more money, and so they would sometimes demand that there be like a short little English section, like a summary. And so that starts to appear a little later in these books also.
I'm just thinking as you're doing this Q&A about the connections with this kind of articulation of grassroots memory that belongs to the Yiddish world.
Yes.
So maybe just to talk about how, yes, everybody knows about the verbal, the testimony in Eichmann trial and so on. But this is something else. How do you see it as a kind of vernacular cultural expression?
Yeah, no, that's well put. Yes, absolutely. These are, and I feel like partly because they were writing them in their native languages to a great degree, there's a way in which they're like conversations. And they also, like, for example, talk of revenge, which I had just one example here, all over the place. Not in a specific way, like I was going to go out and kill these people, but just I felt like avenging myself, which does not appear in later testimonies. People don't want to admit to having those kind of feelings, but sort of in your own family here, in your own people, it's much more acceptable. And that's an interesting question, sort of like as these get translated and disseminated in different ways now, what do you do with those sentiments and how should they be understood that were meant to be internal in many ways?
So follow up, have you considered any kind of comparative approach to that kind of post-catastrophe testimony, grassroots testimony?
Other catastrophes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not so much my own work as talking with others. I together with a colleague, I had a workshop a couple years ago. It was online because it was during COVID, about comparative memorial books. So we had Yugoslavia, Palestine, Armenia, and then there were a few also. There was a Japanese one. Then there were a few also sort of post-colonial versions, like French Algerians. So all talking about what those had in common and what ways those were different, and that was really interesting and worthwhile. Yeah.
So I also really love this talk, and as you have these concepts, ambivalent emptiness, emotional geographies in place, it did make me think of a comparative event, which was the purge of Armenians from Baku, Azerbaijan. And when I'm using materials that are Armenian on the Soviet period, they echo so much these memorial books.
Yes.
The need to say, we were in this apartment at this location, and it was this person, and they did that, and they go down the street, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, your talk, I thank you, because it helps me think more about how to handle that as a source. But there's a contrast here in that you're dealing with something so material, and it made me wonder, what was the material form before they were published, and what does it mean for these to be books that can circulate? Do people take them to Poland?
Mm-hmm.
Do you find them there? How has their circulation changed over time? I mean, what I'm looking at is something in the digital age. If you put it on the internet, you can't touch these books so much.
Yeah. Although there are Armenian, from the previous period, there are memorial books, and there's a nice article about them that came out of this conference. I don't know if you've seen it. But yes, that's a great point. They are objects and reliquaries, as I quoted there. In not in all, but in some of the Shoah Foundation's video testimonies, people will have it, right? Like it's in their living room. People get to decide, what are they gonna see? What am I gonna wear that day? What do I want? Which photographs do I want behind me? And not always, but many times they'll put that on the coffee table, right where they're being interviewed. And sometimes they even flip through and say, this is my brother. So they were, I think, very meaningful. And some of them even describe, like in the introduction, they basically say like, you can say Kaddish, you can make the morning prayer on this book. This is the site, this is the monument. So they were definitely meant that way. But also in terms of kind of the after story, I was in Poland this summer interviewing non-Jewish Polish memorial activists who are using these books in their own desire to understand their towns and their histories and also to disseminate that knowledge. And for them also, because for them these are hard to get, so they also treat them with this kind of great exaggerated respect and would like show me they don't have the original, they have like a photocopy and they're showing me how important it is to them. So they do have a real sort of meaning to them in interesting ways, yeah, as an object also. Yes, you had a hand, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for this great talk. I was wondering about your understanding and use of the term palimpsest and whether it plays a larger role in the book project, because it obviously also involves erasure or overwriting.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of curious, does that feature in the work of the communities? I mean, you hinted a little bit at it. I'm just curious to know.
Yeah, I'm interested in mostly in terms of the maps and the physical space. There's a lot of different kind of metaphors and images that I've been playing with in trying to write about these books. And the one that I keep coming back to, and I think will be the major one, is memory palaces. The knowledge of the past being stored in this physical place, I think is the one that I'm going to end up with and that I find most useful. But I try out sort of different versions.
So, great, so thank you. This sort of draws on some conversations that you and I have been having throughout the day too, so it's a little bit of background. One of the things that you said at the very beginning was that it's amazing how early this genre started. They're already being put together in the displaced person camps already in the 1940s, and so it's a specific genre that has a really specific temporal start point. I'm wondering about the temporal end point and sort of a Holocaust type question about the transition from memory to history. And what was the end? I mean, one of these books was the last one, or are they still being created today? Because that's what I'd like to ask you about. Are they still being created today, and who's creating?
Yeah. So they start off, as you said, we can point to the first ones. Then they kind of grow each year, getting more and more, and they have their heyday in the 70s. So in the 70s, there's I could find the numbers somewhere, but 30 being published every year, something like that. And then they begin to taper off, but they don't stop completely. And then, for example, Hungarian Jews sort of pick up in the 80s. So Poland, most of those Polish Jewish hometown communities have done what they're going to do by that point. But the Hungarian Jews take it up, the German Jews start doing it, so it spreads geographically. And to a degree, it is still continuing, but it looks more like an online version now. People aren't putting together a physical book anymore, but what they are doing is the children and grandchildren are publishing translations. And some of them, they start off online, typically, but then they often get published, again, in a similar way, like cheap versions that are you could just buy online. And that are not very well vetted or edited or translated for that matter, because they're done by, again, just people. Yeah, so it's ongoing.
You invoke the notion of nostalgia, which to me is a universal sense of longing, particularly when you look at the ancient Greek term, right? The despair of homecoming. yeah, it struck me because particularly in Poland, there's such a strong body of scholarship coming up where nostalgia refers to the post-Soviet subjectivities and where you have a certain overlapping of these temporalities, and I wonder how you have envisioned the work of that.
Yeah, I mean, place and space are really, really complicated in Eastern Europe, and it's so sensitive in so many ways. And these stories that are being told here are also ones that, I mean, the books bring in a lot of those exact questions. I don't need to do it. It's already there. Because of course, during the Soviet period in Poland, there were certain stories about the Holocaust that could be told, like communist resistance. And of course, resistance was only communist. Otherwise, it was collaboration. So some of that is there. But then there's also stories that are being told that are, again, naming names. You know, this guy who was in the army of Craiova, the home army, that's the heroes now. In the post-Soviet period is the nationalist resistance movement. He killed my mother in this exact way on this day on the third step down of the, in front of our house. So it's, the books are putting themselves in the middle of some of these complicated questions already, I would say. But they were never meant to be read by that population. The fact that that population now, not all of it of course, but that some people there want to embrace those stories and want to tell them and are willing to themselves face backlash because of that. Many people, not all of them, but many of the people who I met with are pariahs in their own communities because of the stories that they're telling. And some of them are being much more careful and trying to, one man actually told me, the town's not ready yet. I'm not going to tell the hard stories. No one knows they're there. So he gets to choose what he puts out. So there's a lot of levels of complication, and I'm not at all intervening. I'm just watching that part of it. I did interviews. I'm interested in what they're choosing to share and what they're not.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. And I was wondering about the times where you mentioned Holocaust resistance as martyrdom in some cases.
As what?
As martyrdom.
Yes.
Or I thought I heard that language being used in some cases. I wanted to know more about that. Did the people who wrote in these books write specifically about martyrdom in which context, like the emotional power of it or the physical action of it?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. This is a case partly of the languages being used, that in the Yiddish that they're using and in the Hebrew that they tend to use, which is a sort of this old-fashioned Hebrew, there isn't really a difference. They're not using a modern word for resistance. They're only talking about martyrdom. So there's a lot of very heavy religious languages. The volumes tend to be created by secular Jews. I mean, in the Israeli context, what exactly that means. But they tend to be not created within religious communities on the whole. Yet there's a lot of religious imagery and language that requires some parsing to figure out exactly what they meant by that, because they're going to use the language that's meaningful for them to talk about desecration and to talk about resistance and to talk about death, and a lot of it is very heavily religious. And part of that is just what they have.
I have another question. I would imagine in these sort of collective histories that there must be moments of disagreement or like misremembering, like things that are factually inaccurate, even if they are the phenomenological experiential memory of a person. And I'm wondering, like, are those disagreements addressed in the books themselves? Or how are they addressed by the consumers of the books? So the people, like, are when people talk about the books and there are these moments of discord within them?
Sometimes in the introductions, they'll, in parts of their kind of general apology say, First of all, we spelled a lot of things wrong, and also, we definitely got some facts wrong, or not all of these are going to be in agreement with one another, but no, they're not addressed head on. And sometimes the errors are egregious, like the wrong year, not even close. That can't have happened in 1943. And sometimes it's more interpretation. So, especially the ones published in Israel will tend to be very much heavily focused on the Zionist youth groups. And maybe the socialist youth groups are going to kind of disappear from those volumes, or they'll say, in my school there weren't really any socialists, even though the next essay over from somebody who sent it in for Paris is going to be all about the communists in that town before. But it doesn't get addressed. It's just part of that sort of that collective quality of them.
So a different, the opposite question. What about this impact from the early kind of foundation moment of this phenomenon as a Yiddish phenomenon, right? So this impulse to remember, bearing in mind the name Yizka. Have you thoughts about that?
Like the very idea of it as a Yizka, yeah.
And the kind of compulsive quality of it.
Right, no, that's a great point in terms of this other question of like the words they use, because there is actually a medieval memorbook that, that could have been, and some of them are called pinkis, which is also a little more of a secular term, because a pinkis could be a sort of a secular or a religious accounting. But Yizkar is the most common one and comes to encompass the genre. And I do think sometimes at the very beginning, I do think, and you could see this in some of the early introductions, that what they're doing is kind of new. And they want to connect it to the past. And so to use a historical term, a reference, a religious ritual, is to say, no, we're not doing anything radical here, not at all. What we're doing is something you can recognize, something you know, and it's like they often refer to themselves as tombstones. This is a tombstone. Treat this like a tombstone. So again, they're just saying, you don't have a tombstone for your family, but here it is. We've provided it for you, and you should feel comfortable with it. So I think there's some of that, and then it just comes to be the common term used.
So a lot of the quotes that you picked are very wrenching, very sort of psychologically difficult to read, and it's unimaginable how difficult they must be to write. And one of the things that occurred to me was that these are people who, in many cases, are consciously re-traumatizing themselves. Mm-hmm. So it made me wonder whether you've looked at some of the testimony with all of its characteristics of testimony from the perspective of trauma studies, for example, like Shoshana Fellman or Dory Loeb, mm-hmm. and the various dynamics of the hostility or the relationship between trauma and narrative, or trauma and memory, and trauma and repetition.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I haven't so much thought about that directly. One thing that I have thought about is, there's these sort of moments of testimonies. There's immediate post-war interviews, which happen, in Poland. There's Jewish Historical Commission that eventually becomes the Jewish Historical Institute, begins interviewing people. And those testimonies, those ones from 44, they begin, are as if they're in a courtroom. There's no emotion, just facts. This is what I heard on this day, this place. And then, of course, there's these much later video testimonies that we know and we recognize, and that have certain tropes that are common to them. So what I have thought about is like how to categorize this group. Is it a separate group? Is it just how they spoke to one another? I mean, these people, they met once a week. Not every single one of them, but the people who were involved in the Landsmannschaft, in this communal organization, they met all the time. And part of that meeting was telling stories, and also it was business and cookies and all the other things that happen at meetings. So I tend to think of these as sort of not a new re-traumatization, but sort of their internal dialogues to some degree, but I haven't really thought it through. Is there a hand over here? Yes, sorry.
Very interesting talk, fascinating sources. I'm wondering if issues of gender come up at all that you've looked at least men and women working together to read these books. And I'm wondering, you mentioned that the books themselves were kind of opportunities for people to kind of recreate communities, but were the books the end? Or did the process of creating these books sometimes form groups, organizations, whatever, that then went on to do other, community building activities and things?
Yeah. So gender, I'm still figuring out what can be said. For sure, it's many, many more men who are writing in these books and who are on the editorial committees. Usually, in most cases, there's 8 men and 2 women on an editorial committee, and those women usually have the same last name as some of the men there. Are they the secretaries? Are they the wives? Or are they, getting to do their own creative work? Or are they just writing down the minutes? Hard to say. But there are women who are contributing, and across the board, that is making maps, making artwork, writing poetry, also writing testimonies, also writing recipes, also writing folk stories. So the women aren't relegated into one area that they're allowed to do. That I can see. But the numbers are lower for sure. And I take that to mean just that they felt less comfortable contributing, felt less confident in their skills to be able to do so. But in terms of what they write and what they don't write, I haven't yet figured out if there's a pattern that I can look at. That was the first half of the question. And the second one, again?
Did the groups that came together to make these books go on to do other things that you?
Yeah, so yes and no. And it depends where also. Like some of these Landwirtschaft who were, like in Argentina, where I spent the fall looking at the files in Argentina and Buenos Aires, these Landwirtschaft who were the center of Jewish life in Buenos Aires in the mid-20th century. Like everything happening. They all went, everyone from the same Polish town went to the same resort town to have their vacations the same week every year. And their kids went to dances together. So it was all encompassing. And in other places, much less so. There is, I think, someone who's written about Landwirtschaft in New York, Daniel Sawyer, wrote that it's their last big event. It's the most meaningful thing they do. And then they sort of begin to taper off. And you can see that in the files, that even, the minutes per week get a little shorter over time. But they're also, there's always another project to do. And that's another thing that interests me about the books, is that they sort of claim themselves to be the last and the best and the most important. But in the files, then somebody says, oh, in this particular cemetery in Montreal, we want to put up a monument. Will anyone help us out? And then, of course, they're all sending money to Montreal so that there could be a monument to their town in that cemetery, even though they've already built one in their own cemetery and theirs. So they go on in certain ways, but this is certainly the biggest thing that they do post-war.
You mentioned earlier about perhaps some precedents, like medieval precedents for some of this. Are there more recent ones, like since perhaps attempts to memorialize post some of the most traumatic of the pogroms,
Yes.
the Kishinev and others? I'm just curious about if there's precedents for this in terms of memory and this type of memorialization that then culminates in this.
Yeah, so that is what I'm trying to do, is bring them all together, because I haven't seen any pre-war genre that does all of this, but I have found different pieces. So yes, there are some pogrom books. The pogrom books are usually published in New York. So, because of course, the pogroms, especially those that are happening in the middle of World War I and the Civil War in Russia, nobody there is able to work on that. But refugees and people who left earlier who are in New York, gather some testimonies and put together a list, but they're very much just about the event. Although aesthetically, they do hint toward these later books. They have often, very wonderful kind of Art Deco design, which some of it that gets carried over. There are also in the Yishuv, in the Jewish community in Palestine, there are some kind of similar books about violence that's happening there. And those are often names. Again, it's this necrology. And some of them are about places, but some of them aren't. So they have pieces. Another piece that I think is interesting is the Landsmannschaften, these communal organizations, they had banquets, and they would often put together a banquet bulletin each year. So some of those, especially the interwar period ones, were in these larger, more wealthy communities, were booklets about those towns filled with cute stories, like this is what my grandma said. I have not yet found an exact story that appeared later in a Yizkor book, but I think just the idea of writing in that kind of casual idiom for other people who know the same place, and about the interwar period, and about the, when things were good, sort of. I think that might come from those. And then another area that I think is sort of a part of this is Natalia Lekshin wrote a book that came out a couple of years ago about local histories, about Polish Jews writing local histories in the interwar period in Poland as sort of very common dissertation projects. Jews who were interested in history would be told by their advisors, write the history of your town. And I think that those are both academic works based on sources. They're also very much kind of polemical books saying, we belong here. This is our place and our history too. And so I see that as another thread.
May I ask a follow-up? It's just, then, do you see a continuation in terms of kind of the afterlives, about the forced migration of the cleansing of Jews from the Muslim world post 48? Is this a similar phenomenon that's happening? I mean, I know history is being written about that type of a situation, but do you have community reconstructions of this in kind of a cross-fertilization way in some way?
Yeah, I tried, when we were putting together this comparative project, I wrote to everyone and anyone I could think of, and we did get someone who took part, but he was talking about, so I was not able to find anything similar, but nevertheless, he gave a paper and eventually wrote for the journal issue that we put out about biographies, and that sort of communal, the biographies that are individual but are also very communal as somewhat related. So there are, the idea of a memorial book, when you just say it like that, it could be almost anything, right? It's a yearbook.
I was just thinking 1970s
Photo
Israel with Likud now coming, and a lot of the I just was curious about at the same time that this is the culmination of the publishing houses.
Yeah, no, I would
Curious.
have loved to see those, but I'm still looking
Thank you.
for them. Now, Palestinians were writing memorial books about the towns that now, these Polish Jews who moved to Israel are living on the land that Palestinians in camps in Syria and Jordan and Lebanon are writing books about. When I saw that, my mind almost exploded. So there's a lot of conversations to be had about memory and displacement. Yeah, and what people see and don't see. Yes.
So the questions have me grappling with something else. So if I understand correctly, the books first emerged from the world of the shtetl, right? And those are the first ones. And people don't really regard them as anything all that precious. They're kind of embarrassing, it sounds like. And it makes me think a little bit as a Sovietologist how to grapple with genocide, which is the destruction of a community of experience. And obviously we have specific genocides against people, but at some level that experience of living in the Soviet Union destroys all communities of experience in the name of modernization. And in that framework, the shtetl is obsolete. It's not meant to be there. It's not an experience that they want to cherish. And I guess one of my questions is, does that view of this as something embarrassing because of a place and time impact the memory culture or not?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. One thing that I was trying to trace, I hadn't thought of that exact question, is, those towns that ended up in the USSR. That is, when I talk about Poland, pre-war Poland, half of it was Belarus and Ukraine once the war ended. So what about those towns? Who's writing about those? And are those volumes going to be different from those that were Poland after the war? And there's fewer of them, but they're not different in quality. But in terms of just sort of, yes, the Soviet experience of place and of community and of that different kind of destruction, I have not seen reflections of that. And partly I think that's because, to some degree, like the shtetl is a stock character in Jewish literature, Yiddish and Hebrew, from before the war. Like they're drawing on ideas and tropes that are pre-existing, and most of them haven't had the Soviet experience. We also had somebody who was talking about, at this comparative conference about camps, memory books, memorial books for camps in post-Soviet space. Something you might not want to remember, but people, yeah.
Are you familiar with the virtual shtetl project?
Yes.
I'm a fan.
Yeah.
I'm looking at it right here.
Yeah.
I've used it a lot. It seems like, and you and I were talking about how these memory books, especially since they directly or indirectly document movement of survivors from Poland to the United States, Israel, Buenos Aires, that they're like dying for a mapping project.
Yes.
Of like which shtetl went where and why.
Yeah.
Of all the places you could have gone, why did you end up here? And how did you get there? Who you are, and what were the intermediary transit points, and why here? It just seems to me that with the whole point of the virtual shtetl project is really interestingly trying to take their historiography seriously and trying to be very professional about the vetting of their sources.
Yes.
But I would be interested in hearing about how you thought that a project like that and a project like this might be in conversation with one another.
Yes, well, virtual shtetl draws heavily on the Israel, for sure, uses them always. There's a number of different directions, like sort of, in terms of mapping and kind of taking this further. There's a scholar in Paris, her name is Claire Zaltz, who has chosen to do a very different project than my own, but that we keep running into each other in the same places, which is she picked one town, Lubartov, nothing of a town. And she is doing everything on that town. She's tracing every single person who wrote in the Yizkor book from that small town, finding out where they went, what happened, where their children are, where their grandchildren are, what happened to them before the war, what happened after the war. So the Yizkor book is sort of her starting point, but then she's going, very deep forward and backward from that, which I think is a fascinating approach, and I'm really very jealous of her. So that's one direction, but then there's also sort of the bigger mapping of and the sort of general mapping of these sites and which ones get books and which ones don't, and why that is, and where they're published, and there's a lot of interesting directions. And this kind of afterlife and aftermath of these books is happening a lot in the electronic digital sphere in sometimes interesting ways. And the Jewish Gen, which is this genealogy site, is where a lot of these crowdsourced translations are going. And I've also interviewed some people involved in that, sort of what they think they're doing and what for, and what is the purpose of that. So I'm a lot of pieces.
Thank you. The naming, the Yitzhak of the books, that reminded me a lot about how after World War II, immediately after, even during the World War II in Yugoslavia, for example, the National Committee for Liberation started issuing, even in 1944, medals to partisans that participated since 1941. And they named it Spomenica, which is it's kind of like Yitzhak.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, so
Memory.
Yitzhak. And I just wonder, and they started doing this even in 1944.
Huh.
The war was not even over. So, and then in 46, massively just issuing these medals. Also, there's a paper that kind of memorializes the person and the partisan. So I just wonder, in Poland, right after the war, the members of the resistance, were they given something similar? Is there a connection there between Yitzhak and maybe the Polish term for memorizing the people who fought fascism and the Nazis? So it reminded me, because this is something I grew up with, like, oh, someone has a Spomenica, you know, like, we have a number of people in my family, so that's also
A sense of pride.
yeah, it's a sense of pride, and it's just like, it's really, but it's a choice. It doesn't have to be Spomenica. You know, there could be just a medal for bravery, but it's just like the choice, the word Spomenica is it's something that is like loaded. It's something that reminds me of Yitzhak. So I just wonder how are they doing in Poland? Is there a connection there between these two?
So in Poland, the communist resistance was smaller and less successful than in Yugoslavia. And so once the communists came into power, they were actually like tracking down and killing the nationalist resistance. So it wasn't a good thing to, that memory was not going to be kept. Now those people are being lionized, in the post-communist period. There's monuments, memorials are going up like every day in Warsaw. You can't walk one block without seeing another one to someone who was fought in the Home Army. But there was this kind of break when those people couldn't be spoken about. So I would say, whereas the communist resistance could, but they were smaller and not as successful. And so oddly, like the Warsaw Ghetto resistance, which wasn't communist, was part of the Polish national myth, and those names were known. And again, if you walk around Warsaw, all the major fighters have streets named after them. So it's a bit of a skewed memory there. I mean, maybe they all are, because as you say, they are choices about how you choose to remember and who you choose to remember.
Well, we are just about at time, but please join me in thanking our speaker.